What if I told you that the man who got fired from his own company at age 52 would go on to build a $400 million empire from his kitchen table? What if I told you that his secret weapon wasn't some fancy business degree or venture capital funding, but a simple recipe his grandmother taught him when he was just 7 years old? And what if I told you that this man's story would completely change how you think about failure, age, and second chances forever? Well, buckle up, because today I'm going to share with you the most incredible comeback story you've ever heard. A story so unbelievable that Hollywood couldn't have written it better. This is the true story of how one man turned his greatest failure into his greatest success, and why his journey proves that it's never too late to start over. Once upon a time, in the bustling city of Chicago, there lived a man named Thomas Mitchell who thought he had it all figured out. For over 2 decades, Thomas had climbed the corporate ladder at Fletcher Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company where he started as a junior accountant fresh out of college. By his 50th birthday, he had worked his way up to chief financial officer, complete with a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and the respect of his peers. Thomas was the picture of middle-aged success. He drove a luxury sedan, lived in a beautiful suburban home with his wife Margaret and their 2 teenage children, and had a retirement plan that promised financial security. He was comfortable, settled, and convinced that his future was mapped out in neat, predictable increments until his 65th birthday. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It was a cold Tuesday morning in February when Thomas received the call that would shatter his carefully constructed world. The company had been acquired by a larger corporation, and in the interest of eliminating redundancies and streamlining operations, his position was being terminated, effective immediately. Just like that, after 23 years of dedicated service, Thomas found himself walking out of the Fletcher Industries building for the last time, carrying his belongings in a cardboard box like some corporate cliche he'd seen in movies, but never imagined he'd live himself. The rejection stung in ways he hadn't anticipated. At 52, Thomas discovered that the job market wasn't particularly welcoming to middle-aged executives, regardless of their experience. Interview after interview yielded the same result. Companies wanted younger, cheaper talent who could bring fresh energy to their organizations. The subtle age discrimination was real, and it was crushing. Months passed. The rejection letters piled up. The savings account dwindled. Margaret tried to stay positive, taking on extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, but Thomas could see the worry in her eyes. Their daughter was a junior in high school, their son was preparing for college, and the financial pressure was mounting with each passing day. It was during this dark period that Thomas found himself spending more and more time in his kitchen, not because he was particularly passionate about cooking, but because it was the one place where he felt some semblance of control. Cooking had always been his stress relief, a hobby he'd picked up from his grandmother Rosie when he was a child. Grandma Rosie had been an Italian immigrant who came to America with nothing but hope and a collection of family recipes passed down through generations. She had taught young Thomas how to make her special marinara sauce when he was just 7 years old, standing on a wooden stool in her tiny kitchen, carefully measuring herbs and spices while she told him stories about the old country. "Tommy," she would say in her thick accent, "the secret to good sauce isn't just the ingredients. It's the love you put into it. You cook with your heart, and people will taste the difference." For decades, Thomas had made Grandma Rosie's sauce for family dinners and special occasions. Friends and neighbors always raved about it, begging for the recipe, but he had never considered it anything more than a pleasant hobby. After all, he was a businessman, not a chef. But now, with time on his hands and desperation creeping in, Thomas began experimenting with the recipe. He started making larger batches, tweaking the proportions, adding his own touches while staying true to his grandmother's foundation. The familiar rhythm of chopping, stirring, and seasoning became a form of meditation, a way to quiet the anxious voices in his head. One evening, as the aroma of his latest batch filled the house, Margaret walked into the kitchen and stopped in her tracks. "Thomas," she said, inhaling deeply, This smells incredible. What did you do differently? He had added a touch of roasted garlic and a hint of fresh basil from the herb garden Margaret had been nurturing in their backyard. It was a small change, but it elevated the sauce to something extraordinary. That weekend, Thomas decided to bring a jar of his sauce to their neighbor's barbecue. Within minutes of people tasting it on their pasta salad, he was surrounded by compliments and requests. "You should sell this stuff," became the chorus of the evening. At first, Thomas laughed off the suggestions. He was a finance executive, not a food entrepreneur. But as the weeks passed and the job rejections continued to mount, that chorus of voices began to echo in his mind. What if they were right? What if Grandma Rosie's sauce could be more than just a family recipe? The idea terrified him. Starting a food business at 52 with no experience in manufacturing, distribution, or food safety regulations seemed like financial suicide. But what was the alternative? Continuing to face rejection after rejection in the corporate world that had already discarded him? Thomas began researching the specialty food industry. He learned about small batch production, farmers markets, and artisanal food trends. He discovered that consumers were increasingly seeking authentic, high-quality products with personal stories behind them. The more he learned, the more he realized that maybe, just maybe, he could make this work. The first step was perfecting the recipe for mass production. What worked for a family dinner didn't necessarily translate to commercial viability. Thomas spent weeks in his kitchen, scaling up the recipe, testing different preservation methods and ensuring consistent flavor profiles. He invested in pH testing kits to ensure food safety and researched organic certification processes. Margaret, initially skeptical about her husband's new obsession, gradually became his biggest supporter. She helped with taste tests, offered suggestions, and even contributed her own touches to the recipe. Their children, home from school and work, became unofficial focus groups, bringing friends over to sample the latest iterations. After 3 months of kitchen experimentation, Thomas had what he believed was a market-ready product. But having a great sauce and building a business were two very different challenges. He needed startup capital, production facilities, packaging design, marketing strategies, and distribution channels. All areas where his corporate finance background would prove invaluable in unexpected ways. Thomas liquidated his retirement account, a decision that kept him awake at night, but felt necessary for the dream to have any chance of success. With $75,000 in startup capital, he rented space in a commercial kitchen, hired a graphic designer to create packaging, and began the complex process of bringing Rosie's authentic Italian sauce to market. The early days were brutal. Thomas worked 18-hour days, handling everything from production to sales to bookkeeping. He drove his minivan to farmers markets on weekends, setting up a small booth and personally selling each jar, while telling customers the story of his grandmother and her recipes. The response was encouraging, but slow. Thomas was barely breaking even after covering his costs, and the physical demands of the work were taking their toll. There were moments when he questioned everything, whether he was too old for this, whether he had made a terrible mistake, whether he should abandon the dream and return to searching for corporate positions. But something kept him going. Maybe it was the memory of his grandmother's encouragement. Maybe it was the genuine enthusiasm of customers who became repeat buyers. Or maybe it was simply the stubborn determination of a man who refused to let rejection define his future. The breakthrough came in month 8 when Thomas approached Giuseppe's, a popular Italian restaurant chain with 12 locations across the Midwest. The owner, Giuseppe Torino, was initially dismissive. His restaurants had long-standing relationships with established suppliers, and he wasn't interested in taking chances on unknown products. But Thomas's finance background gave him an edge. Instead of just asking Giuseppe to try the sauce, he presented a comprehensive business proposal that included cost analyses, profit margins, and market positioning strategies. He demonstrated how featuring Rosie's authentic Italian sauce could differentiate Giuseppe's restaurants in an increasingly competitive market. Giuseppe agreed to a trial run in 3 locations. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with many patrons asking to purchase jars to take home. Within 6 weeks, Giuseppe had committed to featuring the sauce in all 12 restaurants and wanted exclusive rights to a restaurant-grade version. This single partnership transformed Thomas's kitchen table operation into a legitimate business. The steady income from Giuseppe's restaurants provided the financial foundation he needed to expand production, improve packaging, and explore additional distribution channels. Word began to spread through the specialty food community. Food bloggers discovered the sauce and wrote glowing reviews. Gourmet food stores started carrying it. Thomas was invited to participate in food trade shows, where he met distributors who could get his products into major grocery chains. Each success built upon the last. Thomas hired his first employee, then his second, then his fifth. He moved from the shared commercial kitchen into his own production facility. He expanded the product line to include different varieties: spicy arrabbiata, creamy Alfredo, and a meat sauce that became an instant bestseller. By the end of his second year in business, Thomas was generating over $2 million in annual revenue. By year 4, that number had grown to $15 million. The little kitchen experiment had become a legitimate food empire, with products in over 3,000 stores across the country. But the real validation came when Conagra Foods, one of the largest food manufacturers in North America, approached Thomas with an acquisition offer. They had been watching the growth of Rosie's authentic Italian sauce and wanted to add it to their portfolio of premium brands. The initial offer was $50 million. Thomas's head spun. 5 years earlier, he had been a desperate, unemployed executive carrying his belongings in a cardboard box. Now, multinational corporations were competing to buy his company. Thomas negotiated carefully, drawing on every skill he had developed during his corporate career. He understood the value of what he had built, not just a successful product, but a brand with a story, customer loyalty, and tremendous growth potential. The final deal, completed 6 years after that first experimental batch in his kitchen, was worth $400 million. Thomas retained a minority stake in the company and stayed on as a consultant, but he was officially a multimillionaire, having built his fortune from nothing more than his grandmother's recipe and an unwillingness to give up. The story doesn't end with the acquisition, though. Today, Thomas uses his wealth and experience to mentor other entrepreneurs, particularly those over 50 who are facing career transitions. He's written a book about his journey, speaks at business conferences, and has established a foundation that provides microloans to food entrepreneurs from immigrant families. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas has proven that failure isn't the end of the story. It's often just the beginning of something better. Getting fired at 52 wasn't the disaster it seemed at the time. It was the push he needed to discover his true calling and build something far more meaningful than any corporate position could have provided. The man who once worried about being too old to start over had shown the world that sometimes the best chapters of our lives begin when we think the book is ending. Your turn to take action. If Thomas's story has inspired you, I want to hear from you right now. What's your grandmother's recipe? That special skill, passion, or idea you've been sitting on because you think it's too late to start? Drop a comment below and tell me what's stopping you from taking that first step. Is it fear? Age? Money? Let's talk about it. And here's my challenge for you. This week, take one small action toward that dream you've been postponing. Just one. It could be researching your market, testing your product with friends, or simply writing down your business plan. Remember, Thomas started with a single batch of sauce in his kitchen. Your empire might be just one small step away. Hit that like button if this story motivated you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because next week I'm bringing you another incredible story of someone who turned their biggest setback into their greatest comeback. The question isn't whether you're ready to start, it's whether you're ready to stop making excuses. What are you going to start in your kitchen?